When I was a junior in high school, my parents decided to sell my childhood home and buy a different one on the other side of town. We were going to be building it from the ground up and customizing it ourselves. Because our first house sold before the second was finished being built, we needed somewhere temporary to stay in the meantime. My parents ended up choosing to get a short-term lease for a 3-bedroom apartment. My older brother and I would each have our own room, and our parents would obviously have their own room as well. The apartment complex my parents chose wasn't exactly a very luxurious place to stay. Because so much money was going into building the new house, my parents were trying to save by choosing an older building. It was the kind of place with thin walls where you could hear people arguing in the next apartment over. Still, I wasn't one to complain and decided to make the most of it. My brother chose his room and I chose mine. We were probably only going to be living in the apartment for 3 or 4 months, but I still wanted it to feel homey. I hung up some of my artwork and a few band posters so I wouldn't have to stare at blank white walls. During the first night that my family and I spent at the apartment, I had trouble sleeping. It was always hard for me to sleep in new places. I did everything I could think of to fall asleep, from counting sheep to playing calming music on my phone. Finally, a little after midnight, I was able to drift off to sleep. A few hours later, a sudden noise jolted me awake. Someone was knocking on my door. I picked up my cell phone off of the bedside table and saw that it was 3 a.m. I sluggishly pulled myself out of bed and opened the door to see who it was. There was no one there. I looked both ways down the hallway and saw no one. Feeling confused, I poked my head into my brother's room and saw him in his bed right where he was supposed to be, snoring. I then tiptoed down the hall to my parents' room. I opened their door just a crack and looked in to see them clearly fast asleep. Had I dreamt that I heard the knocking sound? I was so sure I had heard as clear as day. I shrugged off the incident and went back to my room, soon falling back asleep. I didn't mention anything to my parents about the knocking the next day, having convinced myself that I just imagined it. That evening when I got home from school, I sat in the kitchen doing homework. My parents were still at work. My brother got home a couple of hours after I did because he had baseball practice after school. He muttered a quick hello to me before heading directly to his bedroom. A few minutes later, I heard him calling my name and I went to his room to see what he wanted. He pointed to a framed photo of him and his girlfriend that had been shattered on the wooden floor. He asked me if I had been in his room at all that day or knew how the frame could have fallen from the top of his dresser. But I told him I hadn't been in his room at all. When my parents got home, he asked them as well, but neither of them had been in the room all day. My brother and I were creeped out by the incident, but our parents dismissed it as probably just being caused by the draft from the AC unit. That night, I fell asleep quickly after having been up so late the night before. But once again, I was woken up in the middle of the night. I checked my phone and saw that once again it was 3 a.m. What a weird coincidence. It took me a minute to pinpoint what had woken me up. I took in my surroundings and nothing seemed to be out of place. But suddenly I heard it. It was footsteps from the hall. It sounded like a woman's stiletto tapping on the wooden floor. I listened as the tapping moved from down the hall closer to my brother's door and then intensified as it got to my door. My heartbeat grew faster and faster as I could hear the footsteps reaching my door and then stop. There were a few moments of silence, and then a light tap on my door. It sounded like a woman's fake nail tapping on the door. I was frozen under my covers in fear. But then suddenly, just as quickly as they came, the footsteps retreated down the hallway and I heard only silence. I cracked open my bedroom door and peeked around, but there was nothing in sight. I was terrified. There was no way any of my family members were going to be pacing the halls at this time of night. I didn't want to wake up any of my family members, so I stayed there in my room and got barely any sleep that night. That morning at breakfast, I told my brother what I had heard. As I spoke, his eyes grew wide with fear. He told me he had heard the exact same thing that night. He assumed I was having trouble sleeping and had been pacing. I explained that I never left my room that night. By this point, my brother and I were pretty terrified, but my parents still weren't convinced. They told us that we were probably just hearing people moving around in the apartment next to us. The next day after school, I went to the front office of the apartment complex to drop off some paperwork for my parents. After I was done, I decided to check out the lobby area where there was a pool table, some vending machines, and a lounge area. There was also a sweet-looking little old lady at a nearby table who had just finished up a game of cards with one of her friends. She waved me over, mentioning she hadn't seen me around before. I sat down along her and explained that my family and I had just moved in, and we were only going to be staying a few months. She asked me what unit we were staying in, and when I told her, she got a strange look on her face as if she was remembering something traumatic. I asked her if she knew of anything bad happening in that unit, but she waved her hand dismissing it, saying she didn't want to scare me. I kept pressing her, telling her that both my brother and I had experienced weird things there and were really creeped out. Eventually, she gave in and leaned in to tell me the story. She explained that around 10 years ago, there had been a young husband and wife that lived together in that exact unit. They were newlyweds at the time. She said the pair always seemed to be super in love, but that the wife had a dark secret. She had been cheating on her husband with his brother, both before and after they were married. When he found out, he went ballistic and stabbed her over and over again with a knife, killing her. Afterward, he rolled her body up into a rug and stashed it in the boiler room in the basement of the apartment building. It stayed there for over a week before the smell was noticed by another resident who ultimately found the body. The man has been in jail ever since. The old woman went on to say that ever since the slaying had occurred, the landlord has had a lot of trouble keeping residents in the unit. They would complain of weird noises and would usually terminate their lease after only a few weeks. I was shocked, but thanked her for the information before returning back to our apartment. When I walked in, my mom was making dinner while my brother and dad were watching a game on television. In a rushed voice, I told them all about what happened in our apartment 10 years ago. My mom and brother were majorly creeped out, but once again, my dad just wanted to shrug everything off. He told us that ghosts aren't real, and after all, we were only going to be here a few months, if that, and we needed to make the most of it. I could tell the subject was not up for debate, so I dropped it. Even though my family and I didn't openly discuss it, creepy things continued to happen as the month went on. Sometimes I would find things in my room moved around, even though I knew no one had been in there. Other times I would hear the high-heeled tapping on the floor at night. It was always something. I did my best to put up with it, trying to assure myself that whatever it was wouldn't hurt me. Over time, things seemed to be intensifying. It was as if the ghost was angry at us and wanted revenge. All I could do was count down the days until we could move into our new house. One evening, I think my dad could sense how frustrated we all were getting because of how long it was taking for the house to be finished. To cheer us up, he decided to take us all out to dinner at one of the nicer restaurants in town. The dinner went well, and we arrived back home a little after dark. My brother and I sat down in the living room with our dad to watch a show together, and my mom headed up to her bedroom to get changed. After a few seconds of silence went by, we began to hear my mom scream like crazy from her bedroom. All three of us jumped up and ran to see what would happen. The room had been completely ransacked. Clothing was thrown about and every dresser was open. But the scariest part was the words "Get out" rubbed into their mirror with bright red lipstick. There was nothing stolen and no locks had been picked. That was the last straw for our family. That night we grabbed our most important belongings and checked into a hotel where we stayed for the last few weeks until our house was finished. It was a terrifying experience for me because it made me realize that ghosts are real and they walk among us. Would you have stayed in that apartment? Drop a comment and don't forget to like and subscribe. Sleep tight.